Greetings, everyone. I hope you are surviving the plague and the quarantine that the plague has necessitated. Western Civ, however, marches on, and today we talk about the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth in French. Naissance is birth, Renaissance is rebirth. So, as ever, the question is, what is being reborn? Because, of course, in a Christian context, when you hear sort of born again, you think of a kind of religious revival, right? Unless you're born again, you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven, okay? Well, that's not what the Renaissance is. It is not a religious revival. It is a cultural revival of basically of ancient Rome, okay? If you were a participant in the Renaissance, i.e. a humanist, you looked back with great fondness and nostalgia on ancient Rome. You thought that they were pretty cool. And you felt that if you imitated them enough, you too could be cool. Okay? So Rome is cool and you are cool, and in between Rome and you is a long sort of slough of despond, which then acquires the Middle Ages. Okay, that's why we call them the Middle Ages. They're the time between Rome and the Renaissance, and the fact that we even think of them as the Middle Ages, that is a product of Renaissance humanism. Okay. In Latin, Middle Ages is medium aevum, and in English we get the adjective medieval from this. Okay. And medieval is not a positive word, is it? You know, medieval generally means, like it connotes, in English, it connotes backwardness and superstition and error and fanaticism and whatnot. Now, as a card-carrying member of the Medievalists Guild, I must always protest, okay? Yes, I admit that the 14th century was pretty bad, but it doesn't mean that all 1,000 years of the Middle Ages were bad, okay? So there is that. But, this is not something that's going to change anytime soon. People do think of Middle Ages and medieval as being backward. All right, so that's the way it is. And I mean, even I will admit that Renaissance humanists did do some interesting and innovative things. Now, when we are talking about a revival of the Middle Age, of Rome, we're talking about a revival of Rome. It's not like they revived everything about ancient Rome. Okay? They did not revive gladiatorial combat. They did not start sacrificing to Jupiter. I mean, they all remain Christian. All right? They do not revive ancient pagan religion. And they don't start even wearing togas or anything like that. What the Renaissance is, first and foremost, if the Renaissance is interested in reviving anything, it was interested in reviving classical Latin. Okay? The Latin that was used in the 1st century BC. All right? Remember the Augustan age of literature when Latin really comes into its own as a literary language. Virgil, Ovid, people like that, Horace, Livy, all right? That's the Latin that we like. That's the Latin we want to imitate. Now, why? What's going on? Well, Latin has no one speaks Latin naturally anymore, okay? Latin on the ground has morphed into Spanish and French and Italian and all the various regional dialects of those languages, right? So that's what's happened to Latin as a living language. But, Latin is the language of the church. You have to go to school to learn it. And so all sort of liturgical texts are in Latin. The Bible is in Latin. If you wanted to go to university, all university instruction was in Latin. Okay? So that was the deal. But even in this context, Latin has changed. All right? On the ground, it's changed into French. But even as a formal language that you study, it has changed. The language that you learn in university and that is used on a daily basis by your average churchman is not quite the same language that was used in the first century BC. Okay? And most medieval people, if they noticed that at all, simply wouldn't care. I mean, no biggie, all right? The Middle Ages was not particularly concerned with anachronism. But Petrarch was. Francesco Petrarca was a 14th century churchman who had a day job at the papal bureaucracy in Avignon. And he hated his job. All right, he did not like it's your average middle manager, paper pusher position. And he hated sort of law as a discipline. He hated how people are just use laws to their advantage or always trying to find loopholes. He hated the venality of the papal administration, how nothing ever got done without paying lots of bribes, And we're talking about the church here, right? This is the way the world works. But the church makes some very lofty claims about itself that are belied by how it operates on a daily basis. So that gap has always been a problem. It was certainly a problem for Petrarch. And Petrarch sort of made this connection between the Latin that he used on a daily basis and the beautiful, glorious language of Cicero that he got to read when he got home at night and could go to his rooms and read Cicero. Cicero was a senator in the first century BC. He was a victim of the turmoil of the time. He was murdered by agents of Mark Antony because he praised the assassins of Caesar. And so that was it for Cicero. But before then, he had given some very wonderful, beautiful speeches in the Senate that were recorded that we still have. He wrote lots of letters. He wrote certain books of philosophy, and he was a master stylist. Okay, he had sort of flourishes that had fallen out of date, but he just had all these rhetorical tricks up his sleeve, and if you were become aware of them, they are very beautiful and edifying. And so Petrarch believes that he's one of these people who moralizes language. And he believes that if we clean up our language, then we can clean up our morals. All right? So the first step to improving life that we're living now is to start speaking like Cicero. Now, on some level, this is fantasy. Okay? It would be like us deciding that our language is ugly and that what we need to do is start speaking like Shakespeare or the King James Bible. You look around, you see there's nothing but dirt and grime, and everything's going to pot now. What we need to do is start speaking like Shakespeare, and then that's going to clean the place up. No, I mean, that's kind of silly, isn't it? However, Cicero really was a master stylist. And you've all had experience of reading beautiful prose that conveys unambiguous meaning and that is a pleasure to read. And then there's also prose where you have no clue what the author is trying to say because he says it so badly. All right? And so yeah, on the one hand, maybe Cicero is worth reviving. Maybe the rhetorical tricks that he uses are worth reviving, even if there's no morality to it. All right? And that, even if there is no morality, even if you're just studying how language changes over time, it does lead to something called philology, which is the study of exactly that. The great benefit of philology is that it allows you to effectively date documents. You get a piece of writing, and it's not the original copy, okay? And it's got no author and no date, but you read it, and you think, this sounds to me like a document that was written in 12th century England, or this sounds to me like a document that was written in the 7th century in Italy. All right? It sounds like other documents from that time that we know about. Okay? So this is really a very powerful tool. And it's not just for Latin, you can use it for any language. Okay? Lately, of course, with everything being digitized, you can really get down and you can see the first appearance of words and how common they were in different eras and whatnot. Google Ngram, I believe, is the tool there. But the great thing about philology is that it helps to expose fraud. All right? It's like I always say, if you're reading Jane Austen and all of a sudden Mr. Darcy says to Elizabeth Bennet, for shizzle, Elizabeth Bennet, you're for rizzle. All right? You read this and you think, okay, either Jane Austen didn't write this or someone has been monkeying with Jane Austen, because, Izzle this and Izzle that was Snoop Dogg's private language, right? That was something he did. So there's no way that, Mr. Darcy 200 years ago is going to be talking like Snoop. And it's like, wow, well, either Snoop Dogg is an unacknowledged Jane Austen fan, or what's more likely to have happened is that someone has committed fraud. Someone has monkeyed with Jane Austen's text. That is what you would call an anachronism, right? It's something that appears before its time. All right? It has appeared out of time. And this is what allowed Lorenzo Valla, okay, a very famous Renaissance humanist of the 15th century, to expose the fraud behind the donation of Constantine. Remember that the donation of Constantine was the justification for the coronation of Charlemagne. Remember this? When the Pope decided to revive the Western Roman Empire in 800, the Byzantines said, who do you think you are to do that? And the Pope pulls out of his back pocket the donation of Constantine, which was allegedly written by Constantine, given to the Pope, and then Constantine goes over to Constantinople. And the popes have been sitting on this all these years. Finally, they have a worthy candidate to make an emperor out of. Well, as you can probably imagine, the donation of Constantine was full of anachronisms. I mean, it was written in the Latin of the 8th century. It was not written in the Latin of the 4th century. There is absolutely no way that Constantine could have written it. Not only are there out-of-date words, there are out-of-date things as well. Things published in the 4th century. And so that was a big event in Renaissance humanism. Lorenzo Valla kicked the stool out from under the papacy, one of the central claims of the papacy. Okay. So language, as I mentioned, reviving classical Latin is the cornerstone of what Renaissance humanists are doing. That is not all that they revived. Okay? One of the other things that they revived is a certain idea. All right? And, okay, so, if they're very keen on Cicero, they go around to all these monastic libraries and they try to find Cicero, manuscripts by Cicero, and they try to find other manuscripts by other authors. There's the printing press exists by now, so they really love to publish editions of these classical authors. And the church does not believe in destroying pagan manuscripts, but they do believe that they should be read with care. All right. So basically, if you are reading a pagan author, you kind of have to put on a hazmat suit before you read it. Because you might be infected by those pagan ideas. And frankly, the church was right. Okay? People are affected by the ideas of these pagan authors. Now, as I say, they never abandon Christianity. They never forswear Christianity and start to become ancient pagan. They don't revive sacrifice to Jupiter or anything like that. But they do revive a classical idea that, well, YOLO, okay? In Christianity, of course, your reward is in heaven. All right? So it doesn't matter how terrible this life is. Don't worry, you'll get your reward in heaven when you get to hang out with Jesus. Pagans generally don't think like that. Pagans are not promised a glorious afterlife. The best that they can hope for is a kind of shadowy half-life. Pagans believe that this life that you have is all you've got, and your chief job is to make a name for yourself. All right, you have talents, you should realize those talents. This is what Renaissance humanists found very appealing indeed. It's not that they weren't Christian, they just saw no contradiction between making a name for yourself and then going on to your eternal reward in heaven. Okay? And they start to justify it. They say, no, God gave us these talents, and we honor God when we realize our talents. Okay? So yes, life is no longer a vale of tears. It's something to be enjoyed. Not in a kind of hedonistic way, okay? But it's something you should develop yourself. If you've got talents, you should try to work on them and produce something of lasting value. And you're going to make life better. You're going to make a name for yourself, but you're also going to make life better for everyone around you. Okay? That's the thing about Renaissance humanism. And there's no reason why you can't be good at more than one thing. Okay, you've heard of the expression Renaissance man, someone who's good at a whole bunch of stuff. Well, why not? No one said I couldn't. Okay? So yeah, we have talents, we can use them, and we honor God when we do so. So one of the famous lines from the Renaissance is, man is the measure of all things. Okay? That is, how are we going to improve society? When we do something, how are we going to improve stuff around us? And then there's this lovely essay by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. It was simply the oration on the dignity of man. Man is a unique creature. He is lower than the angels, but higher than the animals. He is the only creature that can improve through self-will. Angels can't go any higher. Okay? Animals are stuck where they are, but man has certain talents, and a man can improve his position. He can devote himself to hedonism as well. He can sink down, but he can improve. Okay, and when he does, he gets all the credit because he has done this. Now, I deliberately say man, and man is the measure of all things. All right. I'm not going to say humanity because the Renaissance really was a men's club. Okay, there are some women humanists, there are some women artists, but on the whole, they're not so advanced that they believe that women can participate. Women are still barefoot pregnant in the kitchen. Their job is to serve men. It's the men who get to go out and become self-actualizing. All right. So it's good to keep that in mind. There's a famous article by a feminist scholar saying, did women have a renaissance? And the answer, she says, is no, they didn't have a renaissance. When we talk about great human potential and all these wonderful things that Renaissance humanists achieved, we're not talking about women. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay. So yeah, so when we talk about the revival of classical Rome, there are some, Rome. Certain things come into fashion, the language, certain architectural things, But on the whole, it's an idea. It's an idea that you can make something of yourself. And because a critical mass of people come to believe this, things really are possible. All right? Okay. Now we'll talk about how these people made names for themselves. They made them in a lot of ways, but one of the chief ways, I mean, it's like in the 60s, right? You want to make a name for yourself, you start a rock band. Okay, well, in the Renaissance, if you wanted to make a name for yourself, you became an artist or a sculptor or an architect. All right, this is one of the main ways that Renaissance self-actualization plays itself out. So for the rest of this presentation, we'll be looking at some pictures, some images of what Renaissance people did. All right, architecture. Okay, basically, Renaissance idealized ancient Roman architecture. Okay, and so you start to see neoclassical architecture. There were never slavish copyings of Roman buildings, but they do start to employ lots of classical details and definitely an emphasis on proportion. Again, it's like the rhythm of language. Renaissance was very keen on proportion in buildings. The Middle Ages didn't particularly care about proportion. In terms of sculpture, you wanted sculpture to be beautiful, but you also wanted to be lifelike. So beautiful and natural. It's just like the classical Greeks. Okay? And then painting. All right? There are very few Roman paintings survived. Okay? So painting is not really necessarily a revival of classical models. But it is about truth and beauty and about making a name for yourself. So yes, good paintings are beautiful, lifelike, well composed. They use perspective, and again, human figures are both natural and beautiful and individual. Okay? And of course, artists were individuals too, and even the patrons, all right? So supposing you're not, you don't have artistic talent, but you do have money, well, you can pay for a painting and you can sort of share in the glory of being a patron of the arts. This is a view of Chartres Cathedral in France. It is probably, well, after Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres is probably the premier example of so-called Gothic architecture. Now, Gothic is kind of like medieval. It's a word that was made up in the Renaissance and applied to stuff that came immediately preceding them. Goths, of course, were one of the groups that invaded the Roman Empire and brought it to an end. Or, they took advantage of the implosion of the Roman Empire to come in. Now, no actual Goths would have been able to build a building that looked like this. But if you're a Renaissance humanist, they might as well have. Okay, this is a barbarian building. This is a ugly building. It's so ugly that we're going to name it after one of the tribes that we believe ended the Roman Empire. Now, this is not ugly. It has its own aesthetic, and it's also a marvel of engineering. Okay. And so yeah, it is very beautiful in its way. But since the Romans would never have built a building like this, we can sort of poo-poo it. Now, specifically, what Renaissance humanists did not like about this so-called Gothic style was that it was all out of proportion. Okay, they wanted to stretch buildings as high as possible because they wanted to bring people's attention up towards God. Okay, And to do that, they would build these massive steeples, which you can see on the front. But you can also see on the sides and on the back of this building so-called flying buttresses, okay, which allowed the walls to go up high without being ridiculously thick. So you could make high walls with beautiful stained glass windows in them if you externally supported the walls with these flying buttresses. Now, if you're a Renaissance humanist, this is terribly dishonest. All right, if you're going to have a load-bearing wall, it had better be a load-bearing wall. To put up flying buttresses to keep your walls up is like leaving the scaffolding up or having guy wires to keep your antenna up. It's just dishonest. The Romans would never have done something so dishonest. So that leads us to a revival of certain classical effects, and it even comes to affect the church. This, of course, is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City. It was the popes themselves, even though there's a kind of, well, as you can see with Lorenzo Valla, there's a kind of, sometimes there's an anti-papal edge to Renaissance humanism, but the popes themselves became great Renaissance patrons of the arts. And they reckoned that they should pull down the old Gothic church on the Vatican Hill and rebuild St. Peter's in a new and, well, to their mind, beautiful classical architecture. So Donato Bramante is the main architect of St. Peter's. There were any number of other people who worked on it. But you can see here, this building is fundamentally different from the building we just saw, Chartres Cathedral. All right. First of all, it is wider than it is high. All right. That was judged to be proper. And you'll notice the windows decrease in size as they go up. That's not by accident. They thought about these things. Okay. All of the internal spaces kind of relate to each other mathematically, and that's very important to do. There was an author that was discovered named Vitruvius, who wrote a book on De Architectura. And once they published this book, they're very keen on delineating kind of internal proportions of buildings. And then you can see other classical effects in there. Those columns are Corinthian columns. The sort of triangular pediment over the front there, that's a classical effect. The space between the pediment and the columns is known as the entablature. Okay, and there's writing on it. That's another classical effect. Okay, you'll notice the arches are round, all right? Gothic cathedrals tended to have pointy arches because it allowed them to build higher, right? A pointed arch supported weight better than a rounded arch. But since the Romans would never have done that, we're going to revert to round arches. And then, of course, on the back there, over the whole thing is a dome. As you remember from Hagia Sophia and the Pantheon in Rome, having a dome was a very classical thing. So we have a revival of domes now on Renaissance era churches. So there you go, from Chartres Cathedral to St. Peter's. You could do a whole course on Gothic architecture, but those are the two data points we have. Gothic on the one hand, neoclassical on the other. Is one better than the other? Well, no, not necessarily. But stylistically, yeah, we want to revive Vitruvius and his proportions. All right, that is what buildings are supposed to be looking like now. Something similar happens in sculpture. Here's a I don't know if it's particularly famous sculpture, but it's a very typical sort of 12th century sculpture. All right. I mean, it looks like a sculpture. It's not particularly lifelike. Okay. Jesus looks like a miniature man. Okay. And the drapery is kind of stiff. Okay. This is what we want sculpture to look like now. So clearly, Michelangelo, very famous Renaissance artist, has spent a lot of time replicating actual human bodies in marble. Okay? So these people, the Virgin Mary and Jesus, they look like real people. Okay? They're not the equivalent of stiff stick figures. And the drapery too is done. It's not just cliched folds, but they're actual, asymmetrical folds. They look like she actually is wearing that dress. And it's not over the top. It's not like they're like screeching and crying or anything like that. It's just a very sad portrait of the Virgin Mary cradling the body of her dead son. This, by the way, is in St. Peter's. You enter into St. Peter's, and it's on the right as you enter. It is behind bulletproof glass now because some crazy guy attacked it with an axe in the 70s, I believe, and they had to spend time reconstructing it. Okay, here is another sort of sculpture that we find in the Renaissance. This is by Donatello. And it is a portrait of David. Okay, it is a bronze cast. Okay, the same process by which you make a church bell can also be used to make a sculpture. So you sculpt your sculpture in wax, you encase it in plaster, you heat it up and let the wax drain out, and then you inject the mold with bronze. Then you break the plaster, and there you have what was once in wax is now in bronze. And of course, you have to spend some time polishing it and whatnot, sanding it down. But this is what sculptures look like. Okay, here is a beautiful young man. All right, who is doing the classic S curve, contrapposto style. All right, he's sort of, as people stand, they might lean on one hip. So that's what we're going to do. All right. David, of course, is a biblical hero. He's an ancient Hebrew hero, but that's not going to stop us from portraying him in the classical Greek way, that is, in the nude. All right, because that's how we do things now. You portray people in the nude to show off their beauty. Okay, David, there is the head of Goliath is at his foot. So I guess, I talked about chronology. I guess there are examples of the Renaissance not particularly caring about chronology either. I think this is an example of how they remain Christian even as they idealize ancient Rome. Okay, so we have a melding of a portrayal of a figure from religious history done up in the style of the ancient Greeks. Right. And so here again we're talking about painting. Here is a very medieval portrait of Crusaders taking Jerusalem. This was done in the 13th century. It's a manuscript illumination, and it has its own aesthetic, but in a way it's a bit of a mess. All right. Basically every figure in here is kind of a stick figure. Okay, there is no sort of center of interest, or if there is, it's that siege tower that's going up, where there's a sort of mass of humans on the top of it. Jerusalem was taken in 1099, and of course it's in Jerusalem. But the artist has portrayed, that's Gothic architecture there. Well, there's no way that architecture would have been, that's 13th century Western European architecture. That is not anything we would have found in Jerusalem at the time. And you'll notice in the background there, well, first of all, you can't really tell it's the background because the figures are more or less the same size as the figures in the foreground. Okay, so we don't have much perspective here. It's kind of flattened. And it's also time is flattened too. In the background, you've got Jesus being crucified, an event that happened in 33 AD. So yes, it's collapsed space, collapsed time, and careless composition with no real individualism in any of the figures. So all of these things are things that Renaissance artists move away from. Okay? Generally, if you take a course on Renaissance art, you start with Giotto, okay, he's going really back. He is 13th century, dies in the 14th century, but this is very typical of his work, okay. What you'll notice is that, first of all, the figures in the background are smaller than the ones in the foreground. And second of all, every figure has its own pose. Their faces kind of look the same, but some figures, they get different hairstyles, they get different facial hair, but you'll notice that everyone has a different pose. We don't have any stick figures. This is especially true of the angels who are lamenting the death of Jesus. Every one of them has his own unique pose. This is foreshadowing the individualism of the Renaissance. You can be someone in the Renaissance, right? Here's another painting, this one by Masaccio, that also illustrates certain Renaissance themes. This is Trinity, the Holy Trinity with the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and donors. All right. Now the Holy Trinity, of course, is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And right in the middle there, we have, right in the middle, the center of attention, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Or rather, there's the Father, and then there's Jesus on the cross, the Son, and between them is a dove signifying the Holy Spirit. Okay, so that's the Holy Trinity right there, right in the middle. Okay, and then sort of down a notch, forming a triangle, are St. John the Evangelist and the Virgin. Okay, that's an artistic convention, by the way. Whenever you see Jesus on the cross with two figures on either side, it's going to be the Virgin Mary and St. John, right? Because Jesus on the cross says, behold your mother, behold your son, right? So there's that, and then one further, to the front, outside of that arch, are the two donors, who are also shown praying to this tableau. All right. So again, the donors who paid for the painting, they might not be able to pay it to paint it, but they can pay for it and they can insist on being included. Okay. So again, we know the name of the artist, Masaccio. We know the name of the donors, and they have been included there. And you can see the whole thing is very carefully composed. The colors alternate, red and blue, okay? And the whole thing forms a kind of very nice composition. You'll also notice the use of scientific perspective, right? There is no doubt, it looks like you could walk in there, okay? That is a discovery of the Renaissance. It's not just that things in the background should be smaller than things in the foreground. They know mathematically, precisely how big they should be. Okay? So that's scientific perspective for you. You can see sort of the barrel vaulting inside. He's almost showing off with how good his perspective is. You'll also notice that, again, there are Roman architectural details here. A rounded arch, the pilasters on the outside are Corinthian, and then the columns on the inside there are Ionic. Okay? So yes. And then you can even sort of compose this if you wanted. You can have a side view of it by showing the scientific perspective at work here. Okay, here's another very famous, well-known Renaissance painting, of course, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, we get the impression that we are looking down a hall. The walls converge as they go to the end. We have a grid on the ceiling indicating perspective. And you've got all the disciples on one side of the table which is always amusing, right? But you'll notice that each of them has an individual pose. So that's Da Vinci's Last Supper, another very famous Renaissance painting. Okay, this one isn't quite as famous, but it indicates another couple of things. Piero della Francesca's The Resurrection. Jesus is coming up from the tomb on Easter morning. He is beautiful. He's natural. I mean, he's very buffed, isn't he? Renaissance people loved sort of landscapes, so that's another thing. We've got a landscape here. You'll notice again, there's Jesus is the center of attention, and the figures are composed in a kind of triangular tableau. Okay. Each guard has his own pose, some of which looks actually kind of uncomfortable. But the one guard whose face is sort of the second from the left there, that is actually Piero della Francesca's face. He stuck himself in the painting, okay? So that's what you can do now if you are a Renaissance painter. Not only are you famous for what you've done and people know you, you can stick yourself in your painting, which in some way is kind of arrogant, but at least he didn't put his own face on Jesus. Okay, and then finally, one last thing that we have here is this is not a religious painting. It's not a Christian painting. This is by Sandro Botticelli. It is the birth of Venus, Roman goddess of love, who was born at the sea and was blown into the sea by the wind. So you have personifications of the wind there, and there is a nymph welcoming her to the shore and giving her a cloak to put on to cover her nakedness. All right. And so now we really are moving a little bit away here from Christian painting, and we are reviving classical religion, although I don't believe that anyone ever prayed to Venus, no one ever sacrificed to Venus, but we can certainly portray scenes from mythology in our paintings. Although I do understand that Botticelli had a crisis of conscience, and he repudiated all of the pagan mythological paintings that he did. So sometimes, there was a backlash against the Renaissance. Maybe you've heard of Savonarola and the Bonfire of the Vanities in Florence that took place around this time, late 15th century. But on the whole, I mean, obviously the painting has survived. And so that is, people are much more comfortable now with pagan imagery. Okay, it's not a big deal to portray a scene from classical mythology. It doesn't mean you're endorsing it. It's just something interesting that you can do because it's the Renaissance, and we don't have taboos against that sort of thing. All right, so this is an overview of the Renaissance. It is about reviving ancient Greece and Rome. They cherry pick what they want to revive, but the biggest thing of all is the pagan idea of making something of yourself, making a name for yourself. And it's great. I mean, there is a real sense of possibility now. On the flip side, of course, is that some of these people really are quite arrogant, petty, engage in all kinds of feuds. So it's not always edifying, all right? Having said that, this is something new. We don't see paintings like this in the Middle Ages. More about the Renaissance next time.